Okay, imagine this. So you have an opinion. And by the way, your opinion is not racist, it's not discriminatory in any ways, it's just a civil opinion about some kind of political issue or something. Now, you feel very strongly about it, so you decide to post your opinion online on some kind of social media platform. Now, some time passes and the doorbell rings. Now, you open the door and you're greeted by several police officers who arrest you, and in the end, you're punished for posting your opinion online. Now, does that sound like a country you would like to live in? Now, imagine asking someone in Europe, for example, which country they believe this applies to. Now, probably the vast majority would name countries like Russia or China or North Korea. Some may even mention the US, given the current situation, because they believe that these countries are extremely authoritarian, people have very little freedom and live in constant fear of being arrested for expressing any disagreement with the state's narrative. And on the other hand, Europe is a beacon of democracy and freedom, so of course it couldn't be any European country, could it? Well, I asked Grok to tell me how many people were arrested for posting content online in 2025. And I asked it to provide me the numbers for a few different countries. Now, to be fair, I asked this question to several different large language models, and they all started with the same thing, which is that apparently it is pretty complicated to produce such numbers for different countries for different reasons. But just to give you a little bit of an idea, here goes. Now let's start with Russia. So in 2025, how many people were arrested for posting content online? Now, according to Grok, it is approximately 900 people, which is quite a few. 900 people were arrested for online activities. Now let's look at China. Now, according to Grok, 1,500 people were arrested for online content. 1,500. Okay, now let's switch to Europe, the beacon of democracy and freedom. So in Germany, how many people were arrested for online content in 2025? Well, it's 3,500, which is insane, especially given the size difference in population between Germany and both Russia and especially China, of course. But okay, let's go to another European country, the UK. How many people? 11,000. And yes, you heard it correctly, that's 11,000. Now, this is just one example, but there are many more indications that Europe might not be all that democratic and free as many people might think. Now, first of all, there's the EU itself. Now, given the way it is politically structured, yes, technically one could argue that it is in fact democratic, but it is so overly complicated and so non-transparent, and the people's representation, which is the European Parliament, has such limited tools to influence the course of the EU. Let's just say that there's a lot of wiggle room for those in power to kind of circumvent almost all democratic aspects of the political structure. I mean, it's a mess. And is it a mess by design? Who knows? Now, another example is how the EU came down disproportionately harshly on pro-Palestinian protesters. And we've seen this not only in the UK and Germany, but all over Europe. And in fact, according to Amnesty International, across Europe, we've been seeing a pattern of rising restrictions on peaceful protests. Now, another example is the implementation of the European Digital Services Act, which to many is very concerning because it might give European authorities even more tools for censoring online content. Now, the EU has also started to censor some media outlets, most notably, of course, Russia Today and Sputnik, two Russian news outlets, and they've been censored because, according to the EU, they've been spreading misinformation. So here in the EU, we're simply not allowed to even hear what they have to say. I mean, even if they were spreading misinformation, would censoring them really be the best way to deal with that? Really? Now, speaking of the EU in the context of rising authoritarianism in Europe, what might be most disturbing of all is the EU sanctioning. Now, I think we all know that the EU has been putting an insane amount of sanctions on Russia for what's been happening in Ukraine. And I think we also know that the EU has been sanctioning many other countries in an attempt to force these countries into submission. But what many may not know is that the EU also started sanctioning individual people, including European and even EU citizens. And I think that most people don't realize how severe that punishment actually is. Now let's take, for example, the case against Jacques Beau, which is probably the most prominent case in this context. So Jacques Beau is a Swiss national, and by the way, of course, Switzerland technically isn't part of the EU, but it's close enough. Now, he's a former Swiss Army colonel and strategic analyst, and he's been pretty outspoken about the current situation in Ukraine. Now, being an analyst, he's been analyzing what got us into this mess. So, what are the underlying reasons for the conflict in Ukraine, and who played which role in all of this? Now, it so happens to be that his analyses do not align with the Western mainstream narrative about this conflict. And apparently, that is the reason why the EU sanctioned him. And get this is what Grok says. So Jacques Beau, did not break any laws or face criminal charges. The sanctions are a political and administrative measure imposed without a trial, conviction, or judicial process, targeting his opinions and media appearances rather than any proven illegal activities. So this means that even if you don't break any laws, the EU can still decide to destroy your life. Because what this all means for Jacques Beau is that first of all, his bank accounts are frozen. So he cannot pay his bills, he cannot buy anything. The only way he's been surviving, according to himself, is because of the generosity of his neighbors and some supporters. Even though technically other people, even his family members, aren't allowed to give him anything. And also, any organization is prohibited from doing any transactions with him. So for example, he cannot earn a salary, and he's also prohibited from traveling, so he cannot leave Belgium where he lives. And all of this because he has an opinion that differs from the Western mainstream narrative. Now, there have been very similar cases, like for example that of Hüseyin Doğru, who is a German journalist, and he was punished in a very similar way, basically just for doing his job as a journalist. It is just that he didn't report on certain things the way the EU would like him to. So, sanctioned. Now, another example is the case against Nathalie Yam, who is another Swiss national, but she also has Cameroonian nationality. She's pretty well known for being an activist opposing the imperialistic behavior of the French in Africa, which of course hasn't made her very popular with the French authorities, who by the way already sanctioned her for that. But then somehow the EU managed to link her activism to Russian alleged misinformation, and so now she's also sanctioned by the EU. Now, these are just some of many examples, and I think it's a pretty clear indication of the direction that the EU is heading in, and I think it is very concerning. But the question is, why is the EU behaving like this? What is going on here? What do you believe? Is it A, so European political leaders want the best for Europe, you know, that beacon of democracy and freedom, and they want the best for their citizens, so they're doing everything in their power to try to protect them, even if it means destroying the lives of some Europeans that haven't even broken any laws? Or B, so for many years now, the European political leadership has effectively been taken over by the United States. So they're basically doing everything that the US orders them to do. For example, they were forced to get involved in Ukraine, which ultimately led to all the horrible escalations in Ukraine we've been witnessing over the last several years. Now, of course, it would be very difficult to continue with this Ukrainian project if people started waking up to the truth. So it was decided that the EU should suppress any dissenting voices. Or C, So the political and corporate elites in the US, who basically run the government, they're also known as the deep state, are part of the exact same group as the European political and corporate elites. It's basically the same group of people. Now these people don't really have any national allegiances, so they operate on an international, or one could say supranational, playing field. Now apparently, strategically, it was in their interest to push the EU in an authoritarian direction. And that is the reason why now we're seeing European citizens being sanctioned by the EU only for having an opinion that the EU doesn't like. Or D, let me know what you think.